It's time to skinwalk your way into the woods and hunt yourself some Wendussy. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. One of the most common questions we get asked on this channel and over on my TikTok channel is, what is the difference between a Skinwalker and a Wendigo? And I can understand the confusion because when I first started making content, I did not realize how different the two things were. And that is on 2021, Aiden. Why were you such a fool? What's wrong with you? Why didn't you get better? Why are we still sad?
Top 10 questions, doctor's still trying to find an answer for it.
Oh my god. You need to keep that one in there. Cut immediately to that. All jokes aside, there are significant differences between the two, and it comes down to a lot more than just different versions of the same thing. What you're talking about is two very different tribal groups with different folklore, different cultural taboos, and different interests. Many people, as a result of a failing American education system, believe that Native Americans were kind of a monolithic group with different names. That they were almost like the 50 US states that all speak the same language, largely worship the same god, and share most cultural values. But that's really not the case. It's much more akin to what you would see in European history, where there are broad cultural groups who share similarities, but at the end of the day, they're not the same thing. The Welsh are different from the Scots, are different from the Irish, are different from the Germans. So, the same has to be applied to Native American cultures. They're not a monolith. They're varied and they're very interesting. And the two most at play in this story are the Navajo and the Algonquin, or more accurately, the Diné and the Algonquin. And even that's still pretty granular. I'm not a Native American historian. I'm more of a folklorist on this aspect, and I don't totally understand all the differences. There's also the Anishinaabe. There's the Southern Diné versus the Northern Diné. You get into a whole bunch of different things here. I also am not sure I'm even pronouncing Diné right. I've heard Diné and Dene. I think it depends on north versus south. I'm trying. But it's important that we explain what the differences between these two groups are. Now, the Navajo, being a Southern Dene group, are native today to the American Southwest and the Four Corners region, but they didn't originate there. This group of people is believed to have initially come down from Canada probably sometime around 13 or 1400. And this is in line with a story from the Northern Dene groups up in the Yukon Territory and the Northwest Territories, who claim that there was a group called the Naha, a tribe, who lived in what is now Nahanni River Valley, which we've done a very long video on. I encourage you to watch it, who in the dead of night randomly just disappeared. And this was a warlike tribe. It was a Dene-speaking tribe that would have been very familiar to the groups of the north, and that they came south. And around, so basically there's a story that this Naha tribe disappears, and then around 13 or 1400, the other tribes of the Southwest United States start to describe this tribe called the Navajo. So Naha, Navajo, similar terms, can't speak to the etymology, and they're not the only tribe that may share this origin. The Apache also seem to come from the same Dene group. They speak a similar language and have a lot of similar stories. And I do feel it's important to note that relations between the United States of America and the Navajo Nation have been strained basically since the two encountered each other, but the Navajo did play a crucial role in winning the war in the Pacific during World War II. Navajo code talkers would take English words, translate them into a Navajo equivalent, which was not the same word. For example, tank became turtle, and then turtle became the Navajo word for turtle, and they would speak code phrases back to each other. The Japanese were completely incapable of breaking it, and it was essentially an undecipherable code unless you knew the Navajo language, as well as what each word meant. So you may be asking, how do the Navajo differ from Algonquin tribes like the Ojibwa? Well, a lot of it is simply territory, but they do have significant differences in their cultures. Geographically, however, the Algonquin are mostly the northeastern United States, the Atlantic seaboard, as well as most of northern and eastern Canada. Furthermore, there is an Algonquin offshoot group off in the Great Plains region, about around the Illinois area. Many of the first tribes encountered by British settlers in the region would have been Algonquin-speaking groups. And there is a difference between Anishinaabe and Algonquin, but I don't totally understand what it is, and I would appreciate if somebody explained. I tried to figure it out, but to be quite honest, I was struggling. From what I understand, the two terms are sometimes synonymous, but not always. I read that it seems like Algonquin languages are derived from the original Anishinaabe language, but again, I could have that wrong. Now, what about contact between the two groups, the Diné and the Algonquin? It did happen. In fact, the name we used to use for the Diné people groups was Athabascan, which was a name given to them by the Algonquin peoples. However, it's unclear. In fact, it's probably unlikely that there were any Algonquin tribal groups that encountered specifically the Navajo. But with the tribal details out of the way, what about their description and their capabilities? Well, those also differ. For example, skinwalkers are human beings who practice dark magic, or bad medicine, as the shamans call it. There is variation in the beliefs here. There is the camp that would suggest that skinwalkers are capable of physically transforming and taking on the shape and characteristics and appearance of the animal that they're imitating, be that a coyote, a wolf, a mountain lion, any of it. The idea that they can physically become a supernatural apex predator does exist, but it's countered by the opposite side, which suggests that this is more akin to a berserker from the Scandinavian territories, that it's somebody who dons the pelts of an animal in order to magically gain their instincts and their survival skills, and some of their attributes, like it might make you faster, it might make you stronger, it might give you better eyesight, but that you wouldn't yourself be undergoing the transformation, just wearing the pelts and possibly also taking a cocktail of intoxicating substances and psychedelics. And of course, there are middle grounds through all of this. There are people who believe that you might transform slightly, or you might transform fully but not gain any sort of supernatural powers. There's, again, you gotta remember that this is a very old set of stories, and different groups are gonna have different beliefs about them. But what you can say for certain is that this is a ritualistic practice undertaken by some people in the Navajo tribal group. Another thing that you'll come across in researching skinwalkers is the idea of astral projection. A lot of stories that I read about the topic, and I do want to emphasize that I did not get these directly from Navajo people. These were stories I was able to find on the internet that were attributed to Navajo people. So again, that's the hardest thing about skinwalkers, is it is really hard to get accurate information. But that said, there are stories that suggest that the skinwalkers can astral project, that they can leave their physical body and wander around the astral plane, basically, hopping into people's dreams and whatnot. There's also suggestion that they can use the astral plane, the spirit world, to go from place to place, covering less distance in their own body, but ending up across the world. And that's not limited to Navajo. That's a belief that is shared by groups like the Celts, the Norse, and certain Mediterranean tribes. I'm sure that there are also people elsewhere in the world, but the European continent is kind of my area of expertise. So that's what I know the most about and what I feel comfortable speaking on. But again, I can't say that this is universal based on the research I've done, but I have come across suggestions of it. Now, what about the power and skill set of the Wendigo? Well, it's similar, but not the same. The first thing about a Wendigo that you need to understand is that whereas the Skinwalker is very deliberate in what they're doing, the Wendigo is a human who has lost control. They do not have full faculties. They are driven by an innate desire that they cannot put aside. Whereas the Skinwalker might be doing what they're doing for their own reasons, the Wendigo doesn't have that kind of control. They also supposedly undergo a permanent physical change, not one that can be taken off like a costume. The Wendigo is described by Ojibwa scholar Basil Ames Johnston, a native Ojibwa person himself, as gaunt to the point of emaciation, its desiccated skin pulled tightly over its bones, with its bones pushing out against its skin, its complexion the ash gray of death, and its eyes pushed back deep into their sockets. He goes on to write that the Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton recently disinterred from the grave. What lips it had were tattered and bloody, and he adds that the Wendigo was unclean and suffering from suppuration of the flesh giving off an eerie odor of decay and decomposition, of death and corruption, which is pretty horrific when you think about it. That's a gross thing to describe, but it is, in my opinion, a lot scarier than the Hollywood version of the Wendigo. Antlers! So, that's my opinion. In some versions of the Wendigo story, we're talking about a giant. We're talking about something that is 9, 15, 20 feet tall. But again, that's not universal. In some cases, we're describing something that's simply the size of a man that looks almost dead. Some of these legends that call it a giant even go on to say that it grows in proportion to its last meal, so that if it eats a person, it grows to add on the mass of that person, therefore keeping it perpetually hungry. Something that is universal to the Wendigo, however, is their superhuman fighting and hunting abilities. They are super fast, super strong, have reflexes far faster than yours or mine, and can really only be defeated by the greatest of warriors. And in some versions of the story, much like the Skinwalker, they can, in fact, practice mimicry and ventriloquism, making their voice sound different and sound as if it's in a location that it's not. There's a common saying about the Wendigo that if it sounds near, it's far, and if it sounds far, it's too late. So now that you know where they're from and what they look like and can do, well, how are they created? With the Skinwalker, finding accurate information on this topic is, again, very, very difficult. What I've been able to ascertain is that it is something of a master and apprentice situation where there is some sort of social structure, some sort of hierarchy, and that a person does not simply become a Skinwalker of their own, independent activities, that they have to be taught how this works, and that this can take on a number of forms. So, again, what I have found here, I believe is accurate, but I could be wrong. I want to stress that. You need to understand that Skinwalkers choose to be what they are. They are a Skinwalker because they want to be a Skinwalker. There's, of course, that community aspect I mentioned where they learn how to do it from another older Skinwalker. Some form of violent crime is required. Now, in some of the versions I've heard, this is as simple as they have to commit a murder. It doesn't matter who it is, doesn't matter where it is, they just have to kill somebody. Then, of course, there's versions that suggest, well, they have to kill a close friend or a family member. And then some go so far as to say that not only do they have to kill somebody close to them, but they then have to eat their body. They have to commit an act of cannibalism. On top of all of this, it seems likely, though I can't corroborate it for certain, that some sort of substance use is involved in this, particularly psychedelics, and that is not uncommon to Native American rituals. It's also not uncommon to many European pagan rituals. The Celts, as well as the Norse, primarily the Norse, would use psychedelics. This is often what you hear about with berserkers. What they would do was they would take mushrooms, get themselves really, really into like this mode, and go into battle. And that's how somebody who was very heavily under the influence of drugs managed to be a successful warrior, because they were on substances that heightened their senses of awareness, their agility, and their pattern seeking. So they would perceive things at a higher rate than the people they were fighting, which may be the root of some of the Skinwalkers' capabilities. It could be that due to the drugs they're on, they have sacrificed certain senses to improve others. And just to be sure I drive this point home, I am not saying anything negative about the use of psychedelics. I'm saying that, they kind of fell out of fashion after the CIA stopped trying to use them for mind control. So, they're now being used to treat depression. In case you're wondering what I mean by the CIA was using psychedelics for mind control, go ahead and take a look at our video on Charles Manson. And of course, there's the final act of becoming the Skinwalker, transforming, shape-shifting. Now, that is done by wearing the pelt of an animal that the Skinwalker killed and skinned. So, they do that, they put it on, and then they can take on the powers, the abilities of that animal. Now, what about the Wendigo? I just gave you this very complicated story about how you become a Skinwalker. You have to seek out an elder, you have to commit a violent crime, you probably have to do some drugs, you've got to kill an animal and skin it yourself. Clearly, the Wendigo must be similar. It is not, you just have to be cold and hungry. I'm not kidding. Literally, be somewhere cold, be desperately hungry, and eat somebody. That is how you become a Wendigo, according to the folklore. Now, it's not always that simple. Certain versions of this tale do involve the Wendigo being somebody who simply is overcome with greed, not necessarily cannibalism, but just greed. But in most of the stories, it is up north in the winter, somebody is on a hunt, they get snowed in, they starve, and they either kill or eat the deceased family member, hunting partner, whatever it may be. And as a result, they crave, for the rest of their existence, human flesh. It is the only thing on their mind. Now, in some versions, of course, the Wendigo is totally consumed by this, but not in all of them. And of course, we do have to discuss the physical changes. Now, in some versions, what you get is that there is a distinct, serious physical transformation. That you get taller, that your limbs grow longer, that you get claws on your hands, things like that. In others, it's really just that you take on the appearance of a starving man with frostbite. So, again, these are very old stories from cultures that spread out across the North American continent. There's going to be variation. But what about motivations? Skinwalkers are doing it for the greed. They're doing it for the self-interest. They are taking on the powers of the animal so that they can lie, cheat, and steal in order to advance their own standing. And you might ask, how could that possibly work? Nobody knows you're a skinwalker. You don't go around advertising this to people. It could be your uncle. It could be the guy down the street. It could be the guy who runs the tavern. It doesn't really matter. Anyone who undergoes the process can be a skinwalker, and they do it for reasons of self-interest. Another possibility is that they've done this because they want revenge. For example, the story of Skinwalker Ranch kind of involves this. The Ute were winning a war against the Navajo, and the Navajo, in order to prevent the Ute traveling any further or being able to use the conquered land, placed a curse on it that made it attractive to skinwalkers. And it's called the Path of the Skinwalker, and it runs through the Utah Valley. That's an example of it being a tribe-wide kind of thing. In certain cases, you might end up with somebody who maybe someone killed their family or cheated them in a deal, something like that, and they decided they wanted to get revenge, so they become a skinwalker so that they can get the necessary powers and abilities to screw with that person and to eventually maybe kill them or just ruin their lives. Where the Wendigo is concerned, it's a lot more simplistic. The Wendigo kills and eats somebody out of desperation, is overcome with hunger for human flesh, and that is the primary driver. It's not greed, it's not self-interest. These are creatures who go off into the woods alone. They're not interested in integrating themselves into society. They just want to eat people. And one story that displays this really well comes from another Chippewa individual who described a story wherein a Wendigo kidnapped, and as the story goes, I'm quoting here, as the story goes, kidnapped a little Indian boy and took him off into the woods. But the Indian boy was too lean, and the Wendigo didn't want to eat him yet. So every day it would cut his hand with a knife, which displays tool use. So it shows that Wendigos aren't entirely mindless. They do use tools. They are interested in this. So it cuts the little boy's hand to see if he's fat. And one day the boy is hungry, so he sends him off into a nearby village and says, go get some food, but don't tell them that I brought you here. Don't tell them about me. And the boy goes, and the first thing he does is tell the people about the Wendigo, and they feed the boy, and then they go off to hunt the Wendigo. And they catch it, and they cut off its legs, and leave it to die. And then they come back a few days later to check and make sure it's dead. It's not. It's sucking the bone marrow out of its dismembered legs, and kind of laughing at them about the whole thing, so they kill it. There are other stories that involve a Wendigo terrorizing people near the Hudson Bay. And a great warrior goes up to the Hudson Bay and waits for the Wendigo, and he battles it, and he beats it, and the Wendigo retreats, but then it comes back to fight him, and finally he kills it. So it's not necessarily, uniform that you've got to do the whole cutting out the icy heart and burning it thing. There are other ways, it seems, to kill one, but they usually involve extreme violence and dismemberment. The Wendigo also, as a result, has some variation. Wendigo might have been a term in certain contexts, not just for the monster, but also for just really bad people. Serial killers, for example, might be referred to as Wendigo because that was just kind of what made sense. But at the end of the day, with the Wendigo, the real motivation here is selfishness. It's not just hunger. Because the Wendigo would rather harm others and live than save others and die. And speaking of dying, here's how you kill them. Skinwalkers, white ash is the key. Now, that's for the common man. A shaman, a medicine man, would have more tools at their disposal. They would have their magical powers. They would be able to battle the skinwalker on its own level. But for you and I, a little bit different. For us, the part that matters here is white ash from a fire. You coat a bullet in it, you coat a knife in it, and then you have to take off the head. That can be shooting through the head, that can be cutting off the head. I've seen some that suggest the heart will also work, but what is very, very important here is that you understand that unless you take out a vital organ like the brain or the heart, you're not going to kill it. It will be able to heal through whatever dark magic it possesses. So, if you're going to kill one, make sure you do it that way, and for good measure, burn the body. With the Wendigo, there's a few more possibilities. Most involve cutting out and burning the heart. That will kill most things. Sometimes removing the heart is enough. Sometimes the burning part is required. And as I just told you, there's stories where it's beaten to death, it's dismembered, whatever. So it seems like not all tribes agreed on the heart thing, but it's pretty clear to see that cutting something's heart out and burning it is always a solid way to kill something. And then, of course, you can burn it. Really, with most things, if you want to destroy something, fire is always a good option. But you know what else is fire? Our coffee, Mount Pocono Perk from Tableau Roasting Company in Kentucky. It's delicious. Everyone I give it to loves it. And you know what? You will too. It's good black. It's good over ice. It's good as a cold brew. I haven't really tried it in an espresso machine, but that would probably work as well. Believe it or not, espresso and coffee are different methods, not different beans. Now, we also have several partnerships with other brands. You can see those in the link in our description. One of them is Target, and then we have an Amazon storefront where we can go and show you all the products we love, from whiskey and coffee, supplies, glasses, mugs, things like that, to clothing, bags, books and movies that we love, so on and so forth. And if you are interested in the Target one, you might be thinking, well, isn't Target, kind of like, budget pricing? No, I wear Target stuff all the time. This is a Target shirt, and it's comfortable as heck. You should try it out. It's from Goodfellow & Co. Also, if you're interested in supporting us, you can check us out on Patreon. We have tiers as low as $1 a month that get you access to all of our special content, and the higher tiers get you nice little gifts like mugs and posters and whatnot. And if you want mugs and posters and whatnot, but you aren't feeling Patreon, or if you are feeling Patreon and just want more stuff, we have a merch store, thelorelodge.shop. We have just released some very new stuff that has to do with the Weird Bible podcast, such as a shirt that reads, "Dost thou well to feel angry for the gourd?" Jonah 4:9. So if you're interested in hilarious Bible material, that is the place to go for it. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.